The clock on the wall showed 7:30 p.m. as Maria wiped down another marble table at Le Grand Bistro, one of the city's most expensive restaurants. Her feet ached from running around for the past 10 hours, but she couldn't show it. Not here. Not in front of these customers who paid more for one meal than she made in a week. The dining room buzzed with the soft chatter of wealthy people discussing business deals, vacation homes and charity galas. Crystal glasses clinked against each other as waiters in crisp, white shirts moved between tables like dancers in a well-rehearsed performance. Maria had been part of this dance for 3 long years, and she knew every step by heart. She tucked a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear and picked up the empty wine glasses from table 12. The couple there had just finished a bottle that cost $400. Maria tried not to think about how that money could pay her rent for half a month. Instead, she smiled politely and asked if they needed anything else. "We're fine, dear," the woman said without looking up from her phone. The man didn't even acknowledge Maria was there. This was normal. To most customers, she was invisible unless they needed something. As Maria walked toward the kitchen, her eyes drifted to the corner of the restaurant where a beautiful black grand piano sat silent and still. Dust had started to gather on its surface, and someone had placed a small flower arrangement on top of it. The piano had been quiet for months now, ever since Mr. Henderson, the restaurant's pianist, had retired and moved to Florida to be closer to his grandchildren. Maria remembered how beautiful the evenings used to be when soft piano music filled the restaurant. Customers would stop their conversations to listen, and even the busiest nights felt peaceful. Now there was just the sound of clinking dishes and endless chatter about stock prices and real estate investments. She paused for a moment, balancing the tray of glasses in one hand. Her fingers unconsciously moved as if they were touching piano keys. It had been so long since she'd played, but her hands still remembered. They remembered the weight of the keys, the smooth feeling of ivory under her fingertips, the way her grandmother's old piano back home used to make the whole apartment vibrate with music. "Maria, table 6 needs their check," called out James, the head waiter, snapping her back to reality. "Coming," she replied, hurrying toward the computer terminal near the kitchen. She punched in the table number and printed the bill, trying to push thoughts of music out of her mind. This wasn't the time for daydreaming. Table 6 was occupied by 3 businessmen in expensive suits, who had spent the evening talking loudly about their latest merger. They barely looked at her as she placed the leather check folder on their table. "Keep the change," one of them said, tossing a credit card onto the table without even checking the total. Maria picked up the card and noticed it was black with no spending limit. She'd seen cards like this before. They belonged to people who never had to worry about money, never had to choose between paying for groceries or fixing their car. As she processed the payment, Maria thought about her own life. She lived in a tiny studio apartment 20 minutes away by bus. Every morning she woke up at 5 to take 2 buses to get to work on time. Every night she took the same 2 buses home, counting tips in her head and hoping it would be enough to cover her bills, but she couldn't complain. Jobs were hard to find, and Le Grand Bistro paid better than most restaurants. The tips were good when customers were feeling generous, and the work was steady. It wasn't the life she had dreamed of when she was younger, but it was honest work that kept her fed and housed. The evening crowd was particularly fancy tonight. Maria noticed several women wearing jewelry that probably cost more than she made in a year. The men wore watches that gleamed under the restaurant's soft lighting, and everyone seemed to be celebrating something expensive and important. At table 15, a young couple was celebrating their engagement. The woman kept showing off a diamond ring that caught the light every time she moved her hand. They had ordered the chef's special tasting menu and a bottle of champagne that cost more than Maria's monthly phone bill. "Excuse me, miss," the woman called out as Maria passed by. "Could we get some more bread? And maybe turn down the air conditioning? It's a bit chilly." "Of course," Maria replied with her practiced smile. "I'll take care of that right away." She walked to the kitchen to get fresh bread, then found the manager to ask about adjusting the temperature. These small requests were part of the job, and Maria had learned to handle them gracefully. Customer service was everything in a place like this. As she returned with warm bread rolls, Maria's gaze drifted back to the piano. She wondered what it would feel like to sit at that bench again, to feel the smooth keys under her fingers, to let music flow out of her the way it used to when she was younger. But those thoughts felt dangerous now. They reminded her of dreams she'd had to put aside, of a different life that seemed impossible now. "Maria, can you take table 22? Asked Lisa, another waitress who looked as tired as Maria felt. "They just sat down and they look important." Maria nodded and grabbed a menu, straightening her black apron and checking her reflection in the chrome surface of a serving tray. She looked professional enough, even if she felt exhausted. Her black slacks were perfectly pressed, her white shirt was clean and crisp, and her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail. She looked like every other server in every other upscale restaurant. Table 22 was near the front of the restaurant, close to the large windows that looked out onto the busy street. A middle-aged man in an expensive gray suit sat alone, typing on his phone with intense concentration. His watch was gold and heavy-looking, and his shoes were the kind that probably cost more than Maria made in a month. "Good evening, sir," Maria said as she approached the table. "Welcome to Le Grand Bistro. Can I start you off with something to drink?" The man looked up briefly, his eyes cold and calculating. "Bring me your most expensive bottle of red wine," he said without even glancing at the menu. "And I want the chef's recommendation for dinner. Make it quick. I have important calls to make." "Certainly, sir," Maria replied, making a mental note of his order. "I'll have that wine right out for you." As she walked away, Maria felt the familiar weight of being just another servant to people who had more money than they knew what to do with. But she reminded herself that this job paid her bills and kept her independent. That had to be enough. The evening continued its predictable rhythm, and Maria found herself falling into the familiar pattern of taking orders, serving food, and clearing tables. But every few minutes her eyes would drift back to that silent piano, and she would remember a time when music was the most important thing in her world. The man at table 22 had been growing more difficult with each passing hour. Richard Blackstone was his name, according to the reservation, and Maria had quickly learned that he was exactly the kind of customer who made her job feel impossible. He had money, power, and the attitude that came with both. "This wine is too warm," he had complained about the first bottle, even though Maria had served it at the perfect temperature. "And this bread is stale," he added, though it had come fresh from the oven just minutes before. Nothing seemed to satisfy him, and Maria found herself walking back and forth to his table more than any other each time she approached his table. Richard looked at her like she was an inconvenience, something that existed only to serve him and wasn't doing a very good job of it. His phone never left his hand, and he spoke loudly enough for nearby tables to hear every word of his important business calls. "I don't care what the board thinks," he said into his phone as Maria refilled his water glass. "We're buying that company whether they like it or not. Money talks, and I have more of it than they do." Maria tried to stay invisible as she worked around him, but she could feel his eyes on her every move. He was the type of person who looked for mistakes, who enjoyed finding fault with people he considered beneath him. She had met customers like this before, but something about Richard felt different. He seemed to take actual pleasure in making her job harder. "Excuse me," he snapped his fingers at Maria as she passed by his table carrying dishes to another. "Customer, I need to speak with you." Maria set down the plates at table 18 and walked back to Richard's table, forcing herself to smile. "Yes, sir? How can I help you?" "This steak is overcooked," he said, cutting into the perfectly prepared meat. "I specifically asked for medium rare, and this is clearly medium. Are you people incapable of following simple instructions?" Maria looked at the steak, which was cooked exactly as he had ordered. The pink center was visible, and the chef had prepared it exactly to restaurant standards. But she knew better than to argue with a customer, especially one who seemed determined to find problems. "I'm so sorry about that, sir," she said calmly. "Would you like me to have the chef prepare a new one for you?" "No," Richard waved his hand dismissively. I don't have time to wait for your kitchen to figure out basic cooking. Just bring me the check. This whole experience has been disappointing. As Maria walked away to get his bill, she heard him making loud comments to the person on his phone about incompetent service and people who don't know how to do their jobs. Other customers were starting to notice, and Maria felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment. When she returned with the check, Richard was off his phone and seemed to be studying her with cold, calculating eyes. There was something predatory about the way he looked at her, like he was planning something unpleasant. You know what your problem is? He said suddenly, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. You people don't understand excellence. You're content with mediocrity because you've never experienced anything better. Maria stood silently, unsure how to respond. She could feel other customers turning to watch the interaction, and the restaurant was becoming uncomfortably quiet. I bet, Richard continued, his voice getting louder and more theatrical, that someone like you has never been exposed to real culture. Art, music, fine dining, these things are foreign concepts to people in your position. The restaurant was almost completely silent now. Even the kitchen seemed to have quieted down. Maria felt dozens of eyes on her, and she wished she could disappear. But she needed this job, so she stood there and took it, waiting for him to finish. His cruel performance. Richard seemed to be enjoying the attention. He leaned back in his chair and gestured toward the grand piano in the corner of the restaurant. See that piano over there? I bet you've never even touched a real piano in your life. People like you probably think a piano is just expensive furniture. Maria's hands clenched at her sides. If only he knew. If only any of them knew. But she kept her mouth shut and her face neutral, just like she had been trained to do. In fact, Richard said, standing up now and projecting his voice so everyone in the restaurant could hear clearly, I'm so confident that you know nothing about music or culture that I'm willing to make a bet. A public bet. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet, which was thick with cash. The leather looked expensive, and Maria could see several credit cards that probably had no spending limits. He made a show of counting out several $100 bills. $500, he announced, waving the money in the air. $500 says you can't play even the simplest song on that piano. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, Mary had a little lamb, something a child could play. The challenge hung in the air like a threat. Maria could hear whispers starting at nearby tables, and she saw some customers pulling out their phones, probably recording what they thought would be an entertaining humiliation. Come on, Richard pressed, his voice dripping with false encouragement. It's easy money. Just walk over there and play any simple tune. Unless, of course, you're exactly what I think you are, someone who has never touched a piano and wouldn't. No AC note from a car horn? Some of the other customers were starting to chuckle, treating this like dinner theater. Maria could see phones pointed in her direction, ready to capture her expected failure and probably share it online later. The whole scene felt like a nightmare, but she was trapped in it. What's the matter? Richard taunted. Afraid to try? I suppose I understand. It must be embarrassing to be so completely out of your element. But that's what happens when people don't invest in education or culture. James, the head waiter, started walking toward the table, probably planning to intervene and defuse the situation. But Maria held up her hand to stop him. Something inside her had shifted. Maybe it was the years of being treated like she was invisible, or maybe it was the cruel pleasure she saw in Richard's eyes. But she felt something awakening in her that had been sleeping for too long. Actually, she said quietly, her voice barely audible at first. Then she cleared her throat and spoke louder. Actually, I'll take that bet. The words surprised even her. She hadn't planned to say them, but once they were out, she felt a strange sense of relief. Richard's eyebrows shot up in surprise, clearly not expecting her to accept his challenge. Well, he said, recovering quickly and grinning like a shark. This should be interesting. I hope you're prepared to embarrass yourself in front of all these fine people. Maria looked around the restaurant. Every single person was staring at her now. Some looked sympathetic, others appeared curious, and a few seemed excited to witness what they assumed would be a spectacular failure. The phones were definitely recording now, and Maria realized that whatever happened next would probably end up on social media within minutes, but for the first time in years, she didn't care what these people thought. She was tired of being invisible, tired of being treated like she didn't matter, tired of letting people like Richard walk all over her just because they had money and she didn't. "All right then," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Let's do this." The words hung in the air like a challenge that couldn't be taken back. Maria had said yes, and now everyone in the restaurant was staring at her with a mixture of curiosity, pity, and excitement. She could feel her heart beating so fast, it seemed. Like everyone could hear it, Richard's grin widened as he processed what had just happened. He clearly hadn't expected her to accept, and for a brief moment, Maria saw surprise flash across his face before it was replaced by that same cruel satisfaction. "Excellent," he said, clapping his hands together once. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the entire restaurant, "we have ourselves some entertainment for the evening." Maria felt her stomach drop. This wasn't just between her and Richard anymore. He was turning it into a show, a spectacle for everyone's amusement. She looked around the dining room and saw that every conversation had stopped. Forks were suspended halfway to mouths, wine glasses sat untouched, and all eyes were focused on her dotted table 12. The elderly couple who had been celebrating their anniversary were watching with concerned expressions. The woman whispered something to her husband, probably feeling sorry for the waitress who was about to embarrass herself. At table 15, the young engaged couple had their phones out, clearly planning to record whatever was about to happen. "I can't believe she actually said yes," Maria heard someone whisper from across the room. "This is going to be painful to watch," said another voice. "Should we stop this?" asked a third person, but nobody moved to intervene. James, the head waiter, approached Maria with worry written all over his face. "Maria, you don't have to do this," he said quietly. "I can ask him to leave. This is getting out of hand." But Maria shook her head. Something deep inside her had awakened when Richard made his cruel bet, something that had been sleeping for too long. She was tired of being invisible, tired of being treated like she didn't matter, tired of letting people walk all over her just because they had money and she was just a waitress. "It's okay, James," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "I can handle this." Richard was still standing, his $500 in cash spread out on the table like a fan. "The bet is simple," he announced to the room. "Our lovely waitress here claims she can play the piano. Any simple song will do. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, happy birthday, anything a child could manage." More phones came out as customers realized they were about to witness something that would make a great story to tell their friends later. Maria could see the recording lights blinking, and she knew that whatever happened next would probably end up online within hours. "Of course," Richard continued with mock generosity, "if our friend here realizes she's in over her head, she can always back down now. No shame in admitting when you're outclassed." The comment stung because Maria knew he was trying to give her an easy way out while making her look even smaller. He wanted her to back down now, in front of everyone, so he could claim victory without even having to pay out the bet. Maria looked toward the piano in the corner. It seemed so far away, like it was on the other side of the world instead of just across the restaurant. The instrument was beautiful, a genuine Steinway grand piano that probably cost more than most people made in several years. Its black surface gleamed under the soft lighting, and even from a distance, she could see the ivory keys that she hadn't touched in so long. Her hands were shaking now, and she clasped them together to try to stop the trembling. How long had it been since she'd played? 3 years? 4? She used to play every single day, sometimes for hours at a time. But life had gotten in the way. Bills had piled up, and dreams had been pushed aside for survival. What's it going to be? Richard pressed, clearly enjoying every second of her discomfort. "Are you going to take the challenge, or should I put my money away?" Maria closed her eyes for just a moment and thought about her grandmother. Abuela Rosa had been the one who taught her to play, spending every penny she could spare on piano. Lessons for her granddaughter. "Music is in your blood, Mia," she used to say. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you're not good enough to make beautiful things. But that was before everything fell apart. Before her father lost his job and they lost their house. Before the family piano had to be sold to pay for groceries. Before she had to turn down the scholarship to music school because she needed to work to help support her family instead. "I'm waiting," Richard said, tapping his expensive watch. "Though I suppose I understand if you need to back down. Not everyone is cut out for this kind of pressure." The condescending tone in his voice made something snap inside Maria. She had spent years being polite to people who looked down on her, smiling while they treated her like she was nothing. But she was tired of it. Tired of pretending their opinions didn't hurt. Tired of making herself small so other people could feel big. "No," she said, and her voice was stronger now. "I'm not backing down." She started walking toward the piano, and the restaurant fell completely silent except for the sound of her footsteps on the polished floor. Each step felt like it took forever, and she was aware of every single pair of eyes following her movement. Behind her, she could hear Richard, addressing the crowd like a ringmaster at a circus. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's see if our waitress can prove me wrong, though I have to say my money is safe." Some people chuckled at his comment, but Maria kept walking. As she got closer to the piano, she could see the details more clearly. Someone had placed a small vase of fresh flowers on top of it, and there was a thin layer of dust on the bench that showed how long it had been since anyone had played. She reached the piano and stood beside it for a moment, her hand resting on the smooth black surface. The wood was cool under her fingers, and she could feel the vibration that came from the instrument even when it wasn't being played. This was a real piano, a concert-quality instrument that was meant to make music, not just sit silently in the corner of a restaurant. "Any time now," Richard called out from across the room. "Or are you having second thoughts?" Maria pulled out the bench and sat down slowly. The height was perfect, adjusted exactly the way she liked it. She lifted the fallboard that covered the keys, revealing the familiar pattern of black and white that had once been as natural to her as breathing. Her hands hovered over the keys without touching them. This close, she could see her reflection in the polished surface of the piano, and for just a moment she looked like the person she used to be. The person who believed that music could change the world, who dreamed of playing in concert halls and bringing beauty into people's lives. "What's the holdup?" Richard's voice cut through her thoughts. "Having trouble finding middle C?" The restaurant erupted in nervous laughter, and Maria felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment again. But she didn't get up, she didn't walk away. Instead, she placed her hands gently on the keys and closed her eyes, trying to remember what it felt like to make music instead of just surviving each day. The keys felt cool and smooth under her fingertips, exactly the way she remembered. And somewhere deep inside her, in a place that had been quiet for too long, she felt something beginning to wake up. Maria sat at the piano bench with her hands resting lightly on the keys, feeling the weight of every single eye in the restaurant watching her. The silence was so complete that she could hear the air conditioning humming softly in the background, and the distant sound of traffic from the street outside. Even the kitchen had gone quiet, as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Her fingertips touched the smooth, ivory keys without pressing down, just feeling their familiar texture. It had been so long since she'd sat at a real piano like this. The bench was the perfect height, the keys were properly weighted, and she could feel the instrument's potential for beauty waiting beneath her hands like a sleeping giant. But her mind was racing with doubts. What if she had forgotten how to play? What if her fingers wouldn't remember the movements they once knew so well? What if she really did embarrass herself in front of all these people, proving Richard right and giving him the satisfaction of watching her fail? Behind her, she could hear Richard's voice carrying across the silent restaurant. "Take your time," he said with false patience. "Though I should mention that my dinner is getting cold while we wait for this ... performance." A few people chuckled nervously at his comment, and Maria felt her shoulders tense. She closed her eyes and tried to block out everything else: the watching crowd, Richard's cruel comments, the phones recording her every move. She needed to find that quiet place inside herself, where music used to live. She thought about her grandmother's tiny apartment where she had learned to play on an old, upright piano that was probably older than both of them combined. The keys had been yellowed with age and some of them stuck, but Abuela Rosa had saved for months to buy that piano from a church that was getting rid of it. "Music is not about having the fanciest instrument, Mia," her grandmother used to say while adjusting Maria's hand position. "Music comes from here," she would tap her chest over her heart, "and here," she would tap her temple. "The piano is just how we let it out into the world." Maria could almost hear her grandmother's voice now, gentle but firm, encouraging but demanding excellence. "Don't play the notes, Mia. Play the feeling behind the notes. Make people feel what you feel." She opened her eyes and looked down at the keys. They were beautiful, perfectly maintained and tuned, probably worth more than she made in several years. But they were still just black and white keys, the same pattern she had memorized as a child. The same notes that existed on every piano in the world. Her right hand moved almost without her conscious decision, finding middle C as naturally as breathing. The note rang out clear and pure in the silent restaurant, and she heard a few people shift in their seats. One simple note, but it was perfectly in tune, perfectly timed, and it seemed to hang in the air like a promise. "There we go," Richard's voice cut through the moment. "One note down, only a few dozen more to make an actual song. If you can manage it." Maria ignored him and played the C again, then moved up to D, then E simple notes. The beginning of a scale that any child could play. But something was happening to her hands, something she hadn't felt in years. Her fingers were starting to. Remember, she played a simple C major scale, up and down, her fingers finding their old positions on the keys like they had never left. The muscle memory was still there, buried under years of serving tables and washing dishes, but awakening now like flowers blooming after a long winter. The scale was clean and even, each note perfectly placed and timed. It wasn't fancy or impressive, but it was correct, and she could hear the surprise in the small sounds people made around the restaurant. They had expected her to struggle, to hunt and peck for notes like someone who had never touched a piano before. "Well," Richard said, and for the first time his voice had lost some of its confidence, "I suppose you do know where middle C is, but playing scales is hardly the same as playing music." Maria's left hand joined her right and she played the scale. In harmony, both hands moving together in perfect coordination. Then she played it in contrary motion, one hand going up while the other went down, the notes weaving together in a pattern that required real skill and practice. She could hear whispers starting around the restaurant now, people beginning to realize that maybe this wasn't going to go the way they had expected. At table 12, the elderly man leaned forward in his chair. Squinting at Maria's hands with sudden interest, Maria transitioned from scales into a simple Hanen exercise, a technical study that every serious piano student learned to develop finger strength and independence. Her hands moved across the keys with growing confidence, each finger hitting its note cleanly and precisely. The exercise wasn't meant to be beautiful, it was purely technical, designed to train fingers and build muscle memory. But Maria played it with such control and accuracy that it sounded almost musical, each note falling into place like pieces of a complex puzzle being solved. She could feel her hands waking up now, remembering not just the notes but the feeling of making music. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing deepened, and for the first time since she'd sat down, she felt like she belonged at this piano. Richard's voice came again, but now it sounded forced, like he was trying to maintain his confidence. "Very impressive finger exercises," he said. "But I believe the challenge was to play an actual song. Something recognizable. Unless you plan to bore us with practice scales all evening." Maria's hand stilled on the keys for a moment. He was right. She needed to play a real song, something that would either prove her ability or confirm his cruel assessment. But what should she play? Something simple and safe, just to win the bet? Or something that would show these people who she really was? She thought about all the pieces she used to know, all the music that had once filled her days and her dreams. Chopin's delicate nocturnes, Beethoven's powerful sonatas, Debussy's impressionistic masterpieces. But those seemed too ambitious, too risky for someone who hadn't played in years. Maybe she should play something simple, something everyone would recognize. Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, like Richard had suggested, or Happy Birthday, or one of the popular songs that people always requested at parties. She could play something safe and easy, win the bet, take the money, and go back to serving tables. But as her hands rested on the keys, she realized that playing it safe wasn't really an option anymore. She had already crossed a line by accepting the challenge, by walking to this piano, by letting these people see her in a moment of vulnerability. There was no going back to being invisible now. Her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper in her memory, "Don't play what you think people want to hear, Mia. Play what needs to be played." Maria took a deep breath and made her decision. She would play something real, something that mattered, something that would show everyone in this restaurant, including herself, who she really was underneath the uniform and the tired smile. Her hands found their starting position, and she felt a familiar electricity run through her fingers. This was the moment of truth, the moment when she would either soar or fall, when she would either reclaim the part of herself she had lost or confirm that it was gone forever. The restaurant held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Maria's hands found their position on the keys, and for a moment time seemed to stop. She could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips, could sense the potential energy waiting in the piano strings, could almost hear her grandmother's encouraging voice telling her to trust herself. Then she pressed down on the first chord, and everything changed. The opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major flowed from the piano like water finding its way to the ocean. Rich, warm, and impossibly beautiful, the melody seemed to fill every corner of the restaurant with golden light. Maria's right hand carried the singing melody, while her left hand provided a gentle, rolling accompaniment that made the whole piece feel like it was breathing. The transformation was instant and complete. The tired waitress with aching feet and worried eyes had disappeared, replaced by someone who belonged at this piano, someone who spoke the language of music as fluently as others spoke words. Her posture straightened, her shoulders relaxed, and her entire being seemed to come alive in a way that made the watching crowd forget she had ever been anything other than a pianist. The first few measures were enough to silence every whisper. In the restaurant, forks stayed frozen halfway to mouths, wine glasses sat untouched, and even the kitchen staff had stopped their work to listen. This wasn't the simple children's song that Richard had challenged her to play. This was something else entirely. At table 12, the elderly gentleman's eyes went wide with recognition and disbelief. He gripped his wife's hand and whispered something urgent in her ear, but she shushed him without taking her eyes off Maria. The young engaged couple at table 15 had put down their phones, suddenly understanding that they were witnessing something too beautiful to reduce to a social media post. Maria's fingers moved across the keys with the confidence of someone who had spent thousands of hours practicing this exact piece. Every ornament was perfect, every phrase shaped with musical intelligence, every dynamic change calculated to maximum emotional effect. But it wasn't just technically perfect, it was alive, breathing, full of feeling that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her soul. The nocturne told a story without words, painting pictures of moonlight on water, of lovers walking hand in hand through quiet gardens, of hope and longing and the kind of beauty that makes people believe in magic. Maria played it like she was sharing a secret with everyone in the room, like she was opening her heart and letting them see inside. Richard stood frozen beside his table, his mouth slightly open, the cruel confidence completely drained from his face. The $500 still lay scattered on his table, but they seemed meaningless now, like play money from a children's game. He had expected to humiliate a simple waitress, and instead he was watching a master musician reveal herself to the world. As the nocturne reached its middle section, Maria's playing became even more expressive. Her left hand created a foundation of rolling arpeggios, while her right hand sang the melody with the kind of emotional depth that made people think of their own loves and losses. The dynamic contrasts were breathtaking, moments of whispered Intimacy followed by soaring phrases that seemed to fill the entire space. A woman at table 8 began crying quietly, overwhelmed by the beauty of what she was hearing. Her husband handed her his handkerchief and found that his own eyes were getting misty. This was the kind of music that reminded people why they fell in love, why they had children, why they got up each morning hoping for something beautiful. In their lives, the young man at table 20 had been complaining about the restaurant's prices all evening, but now he sat transfixed, understanding for the first time why people paid premium prices for experiences that touched the soul. His girlfriend reached across the table and took his hand, and they sat there listening together like they were in a concert hall instead of a restaurant. Maria herself was lost in the music now, playing from memory that went deeper than her conscious mind. Her fingers knew exactly where to go, exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly when to let a note ring and when to let it fade. This was muscle memory built over years of dedicated practice, but it was also something more. It was the expression of a musical soul that had been forced into hiding but never truly silenced. The nocturne's most challenging passages flowed under her hands like they were simple scales. Rapid runs of notes sparkled like jewelry in the light. Delicate ornaments added grace and elegance to the melody, and complex harmonies created colors that seemed to paint the air itself. Every person in the restaurant could hear that this wasn't just someone who knew how to play piano. This was someone who understood music from the inside out. As the piece moved toward its climax, Maria's playing became even more powerful and expressive. The melody soared above the accompaniment like a bird taking flight, reaching heights that made people hold their breath and then releasing them into cascades of beauty that seemed to wash over the entire room. Her hands moved with impossible grace and precision, each finger independent but part of a greater whole. The restaurant staff had completely stopped working. James stood in the doorway between the dining room and kitchen, tears streaming down his face as he realized that he had been working alongside someone extraordinary for 3 years without knowing it. The busboys and other servers clustered behind him, equally amazed by the transformation they were witnessing. Even the cook, a gruff man who claimed to hate all music except classic rock, had come out of the kitchen to listen. He stood with his arms crossed, trying to maintain his tough exterior, but his eyes were soft and his usual scowl had been replaced by an expression of wonder. The nocturne's final section was approaching, and Maria played it with the kind of emotional depth that comes from having lived through both joy and sorrow. Every note carried weight and meaning. Every phrase told part of a larger story about human experience and the power of art to express what words could not. The melody seemed to float above the accompaniment like a prayer rising toward something higher and more beautiful than the ordinary world. As the piece drew to its close, the final notes hung in the air like incense in a cathedral. Maria's hands moved through the last measures with reverent care, each note placed exactly where it needed to be to create the perfect ending. The final chord rang out pure and clear, then slowly faded into silence that felt sacred and complete. For several heartbeats after the music stopped, nobody moved. The silence was profound and respectful, the kind of quiet that follows something truly extraordinary. Maria sat at the piano with her hands still resting on the keys as if she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. She had played again. Really played the way she used to dream of playing, the way music was meant to be shared with the world. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. The applause started with one person, then spread like wildfire through the restaurant. It wasn't polite dinner party clapping, but genuine thunderous applause from people who had just witnessed something extraordinary. Hands came together in appreciation that seemed to shake the very walls of the elegant dining room. Maria sat at the piano bench, still not quite believing what had just happened. Her hands remained on the keys, trembling slightly now that the music had stopped and reality was flooding back in. She had done it. She had really done it. After years of silence, years of keeping this part of herself hidden away, she had played again. The elderly gentleman at table 12 was the first to stand up, his chair scraping against the floor as he rose to his feet. His applause was vigorous and sustained, and Maria could see tears glistening in his eyes. His wife joined him, then the young engaged couple, then more and more people until nearly the entire restaurant was giving her a standing ovation. "Incredible," someone shouted from the back of the room. "Absolutely incredible. Where did she learn to play like that?" asked another voice. "That was professional level playing," said a woman near the window, but it was the elderly man at table 12 who seemed most affected by what he had just heard. He was staring at Maria with an expression of shock and recognition like he had just seen a ghost. His hands shook as he continued clapping, and he kept whispering something to his wife that Maria couldn't hear over the applause. Finally, as the clapping began to die down, the man stepped away from his table and walked slowly toward the piano. Other diners watched him with curiosity as he approached Maria, his face showing a mixture of disbelief and excitement. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the gradually quieting restaurant. "I have to ask you something, and please, forgive me if I'm wrong, but are you Maria Rodriguez?" Maria's breath caught in her throat. It had been so long since anyone had recognized her name in connection with music. She looked up at the man's kind face, trying to place him, and slowly she began to remember. Professor Williams from the conservatory. He had been one of her teachers during her brief time at music school, before everything fell apart. "Professor Williams?" she said softly, hardly believing it herself. "My God," he breathed, his eyes filling with tears. "It really is you. Maria Rodriguez, the most promising student we ever had at the conservatory. You just disappeared one day, and nobody knew what happened to you." The restaurant had gone quiet again, everyone straining to hear this unexpected conversation. Maria felt exposed and vulnerable, like a spotlight was shining on secrets she had kept buried for years. "I remember you," Professor Williams continued, his voice growing stronger with emotion. "You were barely 18 when you auditioned for us, and you played like someone who had been making music for a lifetime. The faculty talked about you for months after that audition. We all believed you were going to be one of the great ones." Maria felt her eyes welling up with tears. She remembered that audition, remembered how hopeful she had felt, how certain she was that music would be her life. But life had other plans. "You won the Morrison Scholarship," Professor Williams went on, and several people in the restaurant gasped at the name. The Morrison Scholarship was legendary in classical music circles. Only one student per year received it, and it was enough to pay for a full education at any music school in the country. But then you never came back for your second semester, the professor said, his voice full of sadness. "We tried to contact you, but your phone was disconnected. Your family had moved? We sent letters that came back undelivered. You just vanished like you had never existed." Maria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, aware that everyone in the restaurant was hanging on every word. This wasn't how she had imagined this evening going. She had just wanted to prove to Richard that she wasn't who he thought she was, but now her entire past was being laid bare in front of strangers. "What happened to you?" Professor Williams asked gently. "Why didn't you come back?" Maria took a shaky breath. She had never told this story to anyone, had never put into words what it felt like to watch her dreams crumble. But sitting here at this piano, surrounded by people who had just heard her play, she felt like maybe it was time. "My father lost his job," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The company he worked for went bankrupt, and he couldn't find anything else. We lost our house, had to sell everything we owned just to survive. My grandmother got sick and needed surgery we couldn't afford." The restaurant was completely silent now, everyone listening to this unexpected confession. "I had to choose," Maria continued, her voice getting stronger. "I could go to music school and follow my dreams, or I could work and help my family keep food on the table. It wasn't really a choice at all." Professor Williams nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You gave up your scholarship to take care of your family." "Someone had to," Maria said simply. "My parents were too proud to ask for help, and my grandmother needed medicine. Music seemed like a luxury when people I loved were suffering. But your talent," Professor Williams said, his voice thick with emotion. "What you just played, that level of skill doesn't just disappear. You've been practicing, studying, keeping your abilities sharp. Maria shook her head. I haven't touched a piano in 3 years. I couldn't afford one, and every time I tried to play at the community center or somewhere public, it hurt too much. It reminded me of everything I had given up. The confession hung in the air like a weight. Several people in the restaurant were crying now, moved by the story of sacrifice and lost dreams. Even some of the toughest-looking businessmen seemed affected by what they had heard. Richard, who had been standing, frozen by his table throughout this entire exchange, finally found his voice. "But if you haven't played in 3 years," he said, confusion clear in his tone, "how did you just play like that?" That was ... was extraordinary. Maria looked at him, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, she didn't see cruelty in his eyes. Just genuine bewilderment and something that might have been respect. "Some things you never forget," she said simply. "Music isn't just something you do. It's something you are. I stopped playing, but I never stopped being a musician." Professor Williams was shaking his head in amazement. "Maria, do you understand what you just did? You played one of the most technically demanding pieces in the piano repertoire, from memory after 3 years without practice. That's not just talent, that's genius." The word hung in the air, and Maria felt something shifting inside her chest. For so long, she had thought of herself as just a waitress, just someone who served other people and cleaned up their messes. But sitting here at this piano, surrounded by people who had just heard her true voice, she was beginning to remember who she really was underneath all the years of survival and compromise. "The question now," Professor Williams said, his eyes bright with possibility, "is what are you going to do about it?" Professor Williams's question hung in the air like a challenge and a promise all at once. What was Maria going to do about her extraordinary talent? But before she could even begin to process the weight of that question, something magical was happening around her. The atmosphere in the restaurant had completely transformed. Where there had been the usual dinner conversation about business deals and stock prices, now there was something deeper, something that touched the very hearts of everyone present. People who had come in as strangers were now looking at each other with tears in their eyes, united by the beauty they had just witnessed. At table 8, the woman who had been crying during the performance was still wiping her eyes. "I haven't felt anything like that since my mother used to sing lullabies to me," she told her husband, her voice thick with emotion. "That music brought back memories I thought I had forgotten." Her husband nodded, his own eyes glistening. "It reminded me why I fell in love with you in the first place," he said softly. "Remember our first date at that little jazz club? The way the music made everything else disappear? Similar conversations were happening all around the restaurant." The young engaged couple at table 15 were holding hands tightly, both of them looking at Maria with new understanding. "I was complaining about the cost of our wedding all week," the young man said to his fiancée. "But listening to her play, I realized that some things are worth every penny. Some moments change your life forever." His fiancée squeezed his hand. "She gave up everything for her family," she whispered. "That's the kind of love I want us to have for each other." Even the restaurant staff seemed different now. James stood near the kitchen door with tears still wet on his cheeks, looking at Maria like he was seeing her for the first time in 3 years. "She's been here all this time," he said to Lisa, one of the other servers. "Working double shifts. Never complaining, always helping others, and we never knew." Lisa nodded, her own voice emotional. "Remember when I was going through my divorce last year, and she covered my shifts without asking for anything in return? She said she understood what it was like when life falls apart." "And when my son was in the hospital," added Carlos, one of the busboys, "she organized a collection from all the staff to help with my medical bills. She barely knew me, but she cared enough to help." The stories began flowing as the staff and customers started connecting Maria's kindness with her sacrifice. She hadn't just given up her dreams. She had spent years quietly, helping others while her own heart was breaking. But it was the reaction from some of the wealthier customers that surprised everyone the most. These were people who usually measured everything in terms of money and status. Yet something about Maria's story and her music had touched places in their hearts they had forgotten existed. The businessman at table 20, who had been loudly discussing a corporate merger all evening, was now sitting quietly with his head in his hands. "I've spent 30 years climbing the corporate ladder," he said to his dinner companion. "I've made millions of dollars, bought houses and cars and everything I thought mattered. But when was the last time I created something beautiful? When was the last time I did something that truly mattered?" His companion, a woman who ran her own investment firm, nodded slowly. "That girl gave up a career that could have made her famous, could have brought beauty to thousands of people, just to help her family survive. And here we are, arguing about profit margins and market shares." Even Richard, who had started this entire situation with his cruel challenge, seemed to be undergoing his own transformation. He stood beside his table, looking smaller somehow, like the arrogance that had defined him earlier had been stripped away by the power of Maria's performance. "I don't understand," he said, his voice quiet and confused. "I've attended galas at Carnegie Hall, I've heard world-famous pianists perform, but nothing has ever affected me like this." "Why is that?" Professor Williams, who had been listening to all these conversations with growing amazement, turned to address not just Richard, but the entire restaurant. "Because you didn't just hear technique tonight," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet room. "You heard a human soul expressing itself through music. You heard someone who has experienced real loss, real sacrifice, real love, and who channeled all of that into her playing." He gestured toward Maria, who was still sitting at the piano, overwhelmed by everything that was happening around her. "Technical skill can be taught," the professor continued. "But what you heard tonight, that depth of emotion, that ability to touch hearts and change minds, that comes from living life fully, from experiencing both joy and sorrow, from understanding what really matters." The restaurant had become like a chapel now, with people speaking in hushed, reverent tones. The usual sounds of clinking silverware and casual chatter had been replaced by something deeper and more meaningful. An elderly woman at table 6, who had been dining alone, slowly stood up and walked toward Maria. She was elegantly dressed and carried herself with the dignity of someone who had lived through many decades of both triumph and tragedy. "My dear," she said gently, placing a wrinkled hand on Maria's shoulder, "I am Catherine Morrison." The name sent a ripple of recognition through those who knew classical music. Catherine Morrison was the widow of the wealthy philanthropist who had established the Morrison Scholarship that Maria had won years ago. "I've been coming to this restaurant for 20 years, Mrs. Morrison continued, her voice warm but strong. "I've heard many performances, attended countless concerts. But what you did tonight reminded me why my husband started that scholarship in the first place." She paused, looking directly into Maria's eyes. "He used to say that true artistry couldn't be bought or sold. It had to be lived, experienced, earned through both suffering and joy. Tonight you proved that he was right." The room was completely silent now, everyone hanging on every word that Mrs. Morrison spoke. "You won our scholarship once before," she said, her voice growing stronger, "and circumstances prevented you from using it. But scholarship isn't just about money, dear. It's about recognizing and nurturing the gifts that make the world more beautiful." She reached into her elegant purse and pulled out a business card, placing it gently on the piano beside Maria's hands. "When you're ready," Mrs. Morrison said with a smile that seemed to light up her entire face, "call me. The scholarship still exists, and there are people who would move mountains to help someone with your talent return to music." Maria stared at the card, her hands shaking as she picked it up. It felt like holding a piece of her lost dreams, a bridge between the life she had lived and the life she had always imagined. But Mrs. Morrison wasn't finished. She turned to address the entire restaurant, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades in the world of arts patronage. "How many of you," she asked, "would be willing to support this young woman's return to music? How many of you have been moved enough by what you witnessed tonight to help turn a moment of beauty into a lifetime of artistic expression?" The response was immediate and overwhelming. Hands shot up around the restaurant, voices called out pledges of support, and business cards began appearing on tables. As people offered everything from financial backing to performance opportunities, the transformation was complete. What had started as Richard's cruel attempt to humiliate a waitress had become something none of them could have imagined. A moment that changed not just Maria's life, but the lives of everyone who witnessed it. The business cards and offers of support kept coming, piling up on the piano like autumn leaves. Maria stared at them in disbelief, her mind struggling to process how quickly her entire world had changed. 20 minutes ago, she had been just another waitress serving expensive food to wealthy customers. Now she was surrounded by people offering to help rebuild the dreams she thought she had lost forever, but it was Richard's approach that surprised everyone the most. The man who had started this entire evening with his cruel challenge walked slowly toward the piano, his earlier arrogance completely gone. His expensive suit seemed to hang differently on him now, like the confidence it had represented had evaporated. Along with his misconceptions about who Maria really was, he stopped a few feet away from the piano bench and stood there for a long moment, clearly struggling with words that didn't come easily to someone used to being in control of every situation. "I need to apologize," he said finally, his voice barely audible to the people closest to him. "Not just for tonight, but for the kind of person I've become. The kind of person who judges others based on their job or their clothes or their bank account." He reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet, but instead of the $500 he had originally offered, he pulled out a much thicker stack of bills. "This isn't enough," he said, placing the money on the piano. "It could never be enough to make up for what I tried to do to you tonight. But it's a start." Maria looked at the money, then back at Richard's face. She could see genuine shame there, genuine regret for the pain he had tried to cause. "I don't want your money," she said quietly. "What I want is for you to remember this moment. Remember that every person you meet has a story, has dreams, has worth that has nothing to do with what they do for a living." Richard nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I will," he promised, "and I want to do more than just remember. I want to help." He pulled out his phone and made a call right there in front of everyone. "Jennifer? It's Richard. I need you to set up a meeting with the board of the Blackstone Foundation. We're going to be making some changes to our arts funding priorities." As Richard stepped back, Professor Williams moved closer to Maria, his eyes bright with excitement and possibility. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice filled with the enthusiasm of someone who had just solved a complex puzzle. "The conservatory has been looking for a way to reach students who might not otherwise have access to high-level music education. What if we created a program where you could study and teach at the same time? You could complete your degree while helping other students who come from backgrounds similar to yours." The idea sparked something in Maria's chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the restaurant's heating. Teaching music to kids who thought it was out of their reach? Showing them that dreams were possible even when life seemed impossible? That felt like a way to honor not just her own gifts, but the sacrifice her family had made to help her survive. "I would love that," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I would love to help other students believe in themselves. The way my grandmother helped me believe in myself." Mrs. Morrison clapped her hands together in delight. "Wonderful! The Morrison Foundation would be honored to support such a program. And I know several other organizations that would want to be involved." But the evening surprises weren't over yet. James, the head waiter who had worked alongside Maria for 3 years, stepped forward with something that looked like a formal document in his hands. "Maria," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I called the owner while all this was happening. Mr. Davidson has been looking for ways to bring live music back to the restaurant ever since our old pianist retired. He wants to offer you a position as our resident pianist, playing 3 evenings a week. The pay would be more than you make as a server, and the schedule would give you time to pursue your studies." Maria felt like she was dreaming. A few hours ago, her biggest worry had been whether she would make enough in tips to cover her rent. Now she was being offered not just one opportunity, but multiple paths back to the life she had always wanted. "There's something else," Professor Williams added, pulling out his own phone. "I'm calling the dean right now. If you're willing, we can arrange for you to audition next week for immediate readmission. Your scholarship may have expired, but there are emergency funds for exceptional circumstances." As the professor made his call, other customers continued to approach Maria with their own offers. A woman who ran a small concert series offered her a chance to perform at intimate venues around the city. A man who owned several music schools wanted to discuss teaching opportunities. Even the young engaged couple shyly approached to ask if she would consider playing at their wedding. Each offer felt like a piece of her broken dreams being handed back to her, carefully restored and polished until they shone brighter than they ever had before. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Carlos, the busboy whose son had been in the hospital, approached with tears in his eyes. "Miss Maria," he said in his heavily accented English, "you helped my family when we had nothing. You gave us hope when everything was dark. Now we want to help you reach your dreams." He pressed a crumpled envelope into her hands. "It's not much," he said. "Just what the kitchen staff collected tonight. But we want you to know that we believe in you." Maria opened the envelope and found bills and coins that the restaurant workers had contributed, money they could barely spare, but offered freely because they had seen her kindness over the years and wanted to return it. "This means more to me than all the rest," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "This means that the people who really know me believe I can do this." As the evening wound down, Maria found herself surrounded by a stack of business cards, several formal offers, and most importantly, a group of people who had seen her for who she really was and decided to help her become who she was meant to. Mrs. Morrison was the last to leave, but before she went, she took Maria's hands in her own weathered ones. "My dear," she said with a smile that seemed to contain decades of wisdom, "sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places. Tonight you didn't just play the piano. You reminded all of us why beauty matters, why art matters, why supporting each other's dreams is one of the most important things we can do." 6 months later, Maria stood on the stage of the university's concert hall, wearing a simple black dress and looking out at an audience that included many familiar faces from that night at Le Grand Bistro. Professor Williams sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Mrs. Morrison occupied her usual seat in the third row, her eyes bright with satisfaction. Even Richard was there, having become one of the program's most generous supporters, but in the front row, in the seats of honor, sat Maria's parents and her grandmother, who had recovered fully from her illness. They had never heard their daughter perform in a real concert hall, and the pride on their faces was worth every sacrifice, every difficult choice, every moment of doubt. As Maria placed her hands on the keys of the magnificent concert grand piano, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. Sometimes, she realized, the most beautiful transformations begin with the darkest moments. Sometimes the people who try to break us end up being the ones who help us discover our true strength. She began to play, and once again her music filled the air with magic, reminding everyone present that dreams deferred are not always dreams denied, and that the most powerful force in the world is often the simple courage to be exactly who you were meant to be.